In the name of the living and eternal God, the strength of those who believe and the hope of those who doubt, who grants faith to those who have not seen and blesses them with peace. Amen. It is probably good to remind ourselves on this second Sunday of Easter that Easter is a season and not just a day. I need to be reminded of that because as the years go by, I realize that I need some time to reflect on the meaning of the resurrection and how we can live into the resurrection. Last Sunday, Easter Day, I posted on Facebook the ancient Easter acclamation in Greek. Christos anesti, alethos anesti. Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. One of my Facebook friends commented, "Are you sure?" Good question. Easter prompts us to ask many questions. Did it really happen? What does it mean? And does it make any difference? Some people think that the central question of Easter is whether there is life after death, but a more important question raised by Easter is whether there is life after birth. How do we live into the resurrection? No one saw the resurrection of Jesus. There were no witnesses present to tell us exactly what happened, what it looked like when it happened. Instead, what we have are stories about those who encountered the risen Christ. What happens in those encounters reveals something about God and also something about ourselves. Something really happened, and it changed the way we see ourselves and the way we encounter God. It brings about a revolution in consciousness. And the question is, which side of the revolution are you on? These stories of resurrection encounter guide us in our searching, and they teach us about how God is found, or perhaps how God finds us. Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, observed that what takes place in the New Testament stories of encounter with the risen Jesus amounts to what he called a laborious recognition. The way Jesus appears to the disciples is anything but simple or straightforward. It is not as if anyone who happened to run into him on the street would immediately recognize him. One way to say it would be that resurrection is not merely the resuscitation of a corpse. That would be frightening enough. But the resurrection is even more disturbing and certainly more puzzling. In the stories, the disciples who encounter the risen Christ do not recognize him at first. He must reveal himself to them, and he does not reveal himself immediately. The encounter takes time. And the process, the identity of the disciples, in the process, the identity of the disciples is revealed as well. They're looking for some consolation to ease their sorrow. They're seeking some closure to the sad drama that they are living. What they encounter instead is something much more challenging. The story has not been brought to a conclusion at all. All that takes time to assimilate and to understand. In today's gospel lesson, the disciples are hiding in an upper room behind locked doors. They are profoundly afraid. Jesus appears in their midst, and they don't know who he is. He speaks to them. He says what they need to hear. Peace be with you. And then he shows them his hands and his side, the places where he was wounded. Only then do they see. Only then do they recognize him and rejoice in his presence. And then he tells them who they are. They are a community of forgiveness. What he says, in effect, is if you forgive, if you embody forgiveness, forgiveness will happen. If you don't forgive, it won't happen. That is who you are. Now, Thomas, one of the disciples, was not there with the others when Jesus appeared that day. They tell him what happened, but he insists that he will not believe it unless he sees the mark of the nails in his hands and puts his hand into the wound in his side. A week goes by. On the next Sunday evening, when the disciples have gathered again in the house, the risen Christ appears again, even though the doors were shut. Again, Jesus greets them with the words that were meant to put them at ease. Peace be with you. And then he speaks directly to Thomas. Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe. In that moment, something breaks open in Thomas. A soul tightly wrapped up in its own concerns, a soul that had been frozen, perhaps in grief and perhaps in guilt, that soul suddenly cracks open. He falls on his knees and exclaims, "My Lord and my God." Preacher Alan Jones says that there is a connection between the risen Christ's offer of peace and the display of his wounds. Alan Jones says, there is no peace without wounds, no peace without responsibility, no peace without the risk of being sent off to God knows where. There is no peace without the goad and irritant of the Spirit. There is no private peace while others suffer, no peace without forgiveness and judgment. The one who appears to the disciples in the locked room is a stranger. The doors were locked. The disciples do not know how he got in. And at first, they don't recognize him. This stranger eludes their understanding. Their imaginations are too limited. They're too wrapped up in their own self-centered concerns about their own safety. But he eludes all their categories. They cannot yet welcome his presence. But in the display of his wounds, his identity becomes clear. This is the crucified one, and he is now risen. This is the one who embodied love, who lived his life as if life were a gift and not something to be clutched onto. This one was not annihilated by the fear and hatred of the crucifiers, he was not annihilated by us. This love, this gift, is indestructible. And he has come back to get us, to apprehend us, to call us out of ourselves and into new forms of humanity, new forms of community. We are to embody his love and to embody his forgiveness, for it is through forgiveness that humanity is renewed. The psychologist Anne Belford-Ulinoff says that it makes a tremendous difference whether we experience ourselves as loved and lovable or unloved and unlovable. And the difference shows in how we conduct our daily business, whether we enhance the life of others or detract from them. We are, she writes, in our actions, or words or feelings, objects for each other to take in. We see sources of good or bad feelings for each other that we project outward into our shared environment. We bring each other in this life a foretaste of heaven's joys or hell's savage, destructive powers. And then Professor Ulinoff gets very specific. She says, the way we run a committee meeting, the way we run our national elections, the way we answer a phone or cook a meal, the way we teach a class or give a talk, or get our car fixed, or speak to our neighbor in the driveway, the way we construct a budget, or refuse a mortgage, or go about farming the land, or sharing a meal with friends. All these actions are displays of being which other people take into their own selves, which then contribute to the building up or the tearing down of those selves. Friends, an Easter faith is about new life that is meant to be shared because it is always a gift. Easter faith is about the quality of our life together in the world. Peace be with you. And that community life is an embodiment of forgiveness. When you forgive, forgiveness happens. When you retain the sins of any, forgiveness does not happen. And that embodiment of Easter faith has its foundation in the wounds with which Jesus showed the disciples. The risen Christ is none other than the one who was crucified. When we see those scars, we recognize our own vulnerability, and the brokenness that we share with Christ becomes the source of our faith and our wholeness. We seek God with our bodies, and the grace we receive is an embodied grace. Our healer is a wounded healer. And so we come back to the central questions of Easter. What does it mean? Does it make any difference? Easter calls forth a response. What should that response be?